Binge the full week of The Ray Taylor Show ad-free over at inspireddisorder.com/plus.
This is The Ray Taylor Show.
Welcome to The Ray Taylor Show, where I bring you the reviews on the latest movies and TV shows, as well as classic and foreign films. I'm your host, Ray Taylor, and on this podcast, I'll be talking about all things film and television. Whether you're looking for a new show to binge or want to know if that blockbuster is worth the trip to the theater, or just want to hear my thoughts on a classic or foreign film, I've got you covered. So join me every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for new episodes, and let's dive into the world of film and television together. On today's episode, I am talking about the classic sci-fi film 2001, A Space Odyssey. This came out in 1968, directed by Stanley Kubrick, also written by Stanley Kubrick as well as Arthur C. Clarke. It stars Keir Dullea, Gary Lockwood, William Sylvester, and Douglas Rain. After uncovering a mysterious artifact buried beneath the lunar surface, a spacecraft is sent to Jupiter to find its origins. A spacecraft manned by two men and a supercomputer, HAL 9000, HAL 9000. This is a classic that I have tried to watch multiple times. I'm a fan of Stanley Kubrick films. I am a fan of sci-fi. But every time I started to watch this film, I never got past the Dawn of Man segment of this film, which is at the beginning with the apes. This time, however, I did get past that segment. Because it's been on my list forever. It has been, I used to have, back in the DVD days, I used to own many Stanley Kubrick films. This one was not one of them. Or maybe it was, and I just never saw it. I don't remember. It's one that I have tried to watch multiple times and has been on my list, my watch lists, everywhere it's been available for as long as I've had watch lists online on streaming services. And finally decided this was going to be the week I watch this classic sci-fi film to find out what the hubbub is all about with this movie. So this time I did. And I have to say, for a sci-fi film made in 1968, I completely understand why it's such a classic, and I agree it is a classic of the genre for all of those reasons. I see where so many sci-fi films and TV shows have been inspired by this movie, clearly. However, the reason I never got past the Dawn of Man segment was because this movie is very slow. This movie has horrible pacing, which is fine. It's completely fine. But this movie is slow. And for a big portion of this movie, very unclear what this movie is even about. What is the purpose that I am watching this movie that at times has very loud and annoying score, soundtrack, audio, because there's not a whole lot of dialogue. And let me tell you, some of the dialogue and some of the scenes where people are talking are kind of worthless scenes. So I know that may be insulting to some people, but I do understand culturally, artistically, in the film universe, I understand the reasoning why this movie is so well loved and why in 1968 this movie was mind-blowing. I mean, especially now, I'm 42 years old, right? I was born in 1980. I've seen all of the sci-fi films for the most part. I have some other sci-fi films on my list of shame, don't get me wrong. But I've seen a lot of the great sci-fi films, especially modern sci-fi films. And while watching this, I'm like, oh, that's where they were inspired by. I've been rewatching Star Trek, The Next Generation, and there's so many visuals, so many concepts in this movie that you see depicted in that show. I think it's my favorite film by Christopher Nolan, Interstellar. I believe I did a top 5 episode of his Christopher Nolan's movies, and I believe that was my number 1. And it was only my number 1 after a rewatch, which I didn't like it necessarily, or didn't appreciate it as much as I did in the rewatch. And I feel like this movie may be that as well. Now that I've gotten through this movie, now that I know what this movie is really about, now that I know I could probably just miss the first hour of this movie and not really miss anything. This is a 2.5 hour long movie that I feel could easily be a 90-minute masterpiece. But I understand why that first hour was so mind-blowing to the audiences of 1968. To see these realistic depictions of space travel, these scenes, seeing the minutia of day-to-day life as imagined by the original author of the short story that this movie is based on. So a lot of that is kind of like that proof of concept type of like, hey, look at what space is going to be like in this fictional future that we're depicting in this movie. And this is what it's going to be like for people to walk. This is what it's going to be like for people to like eat food. This is what the anti-gravity toilet procedure is going to look like, right? Which, after having seen hundreds of sci-fi films and kind of understanding a lot of that stuff, and also understanding how unrealistic a lot of this didn't necessarily hit in the same way Black Mirror hit on a lot of their sci-fi concepts, but still, it's not as mind-blowing watching it in the year 2023 as I'm sure it was in 1968. So I do have a lot of respect for what this movie is doing. I do get it, that it is a masterpiece. I get the cultural relevance of it, the cinematic relevance of it. And the last hour is really compelling, really interesting, and I really enjoyed the last 90 minutes of this movie. But the first hour of this movie is very boring, and is why I failed at trying to watch this movie so many times. So, to get that clear out of the way, that's why. But obviously, if you haven't watched it, it's clearly I recommend it. Especially if somebody hasn't seen it and there's somebody who appreciates film, appreciates sci-fi, to see in many ways kind of the pinnacle of what film was doing, like one that really broke a lot of brains of the time, showing people stuff they had not seen yet in film, had not seen yet in any way, maybe in some psychedelic trip had seen images, had visions of. So I understand that, but from a narrative take through the lens of 2023, the first hour is very boring. Very boring. But the last hour is really, really great. And the themes of artificial intelligence, which is, a theme and something we're dealing with in modern day as artificial intelligence is becoming far more popular and widespread. The idea of artificial intelligence wanting to protect itself from elimination, using artificial intelligence as a way to streamline and make things far more efficient in space travel or in technology spaces in general. So this movie does a lot of things. The scale is amazing. So much is amazing. right? So I would definitely recommend it. But if, if I recommended it to somebody and then they came back and they're like, I couldn't get past the beginning, like the whole Dawn of Man aspect, there's a lot of metaphor going on in the opening of this film. So I would understand. I would be sympathetic. I would be sympathetic to me knowing I hadn't seen it and hearing my attempts and not being able to get back. But maybe people did and I just didn't buy it. But nobody's like, you can kind of just, as you got to get through about an hour of it and then it kind of gets into the story. Like there's even like conversations that people have that have nothing to do with anything with the actual plot of what we find out the meat of this story is. But I do think this film is a work of art. Far more than I think it's a great form of entertainment. I think there's definitely aspects of very entertaining, the last portion of this movie, but more artistic value than entertainment value, I would say. Especially the fact that I think a lot of the things that this film does that are so interesting in the final 90 minutes have been done at even better, right? They've been done in ways that are even more compelling and more entertaining, as things do in time. But I still appreciate that. It's clear how much this film inspired and was used. So many aspects of this were used in so many other films. The opening of this, very great. This amazing visual storytelling, right? Very minimal, very powerful. It starts with like a very long black screen. I literally checked multiple times to make sure I was actually playing the movie. There was an ominous score. The score is there's like I forget what that's called, how the orchestra kind of plays some of the music before. But there's this ominous music that plays in this black screen before you see anything, before there's a title card of any kind, before there's even the bumper, the logo of the production company. Before you see anything, when you first hit play, this movie is already like... This movie is like begging you not to watch it in a lot of ways. The opening of this movie. Although the opening of this movie is a great kind of visual representation of like, before there was anything, there was darkness, and then there's this ominous sound, and then and then there's like the logo screen of MGM, right? And you get the epic kind of title card scene. You have the moon and the earth and the sun all aligning, like before there was nothing, and then there was the heavens, like very, Genesis from the Bible, or, Phil Collins from his greatest hits album. Let's take a quick break from this episode to talk about Attention all Ray Taylor Show fans! We're excited to announce we've just released a line of exclusive merchandise featuring original artwork inspired by the show. Our high-quality shirts and biodegradable phone cases are a perfect way to show your support for the show and make a great gift for any fan. Plus, with each purchase, you'll be helping us continue to bring you great content. So don't wait. Head on over to inspireddisorder.com now and check out the full collection. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll show your support by grabbing some Ray Taylor Show merchandise today. And now, let's get back to the show. So very, powerful storytelling. Obviously, the score. A lot of triumphant music, but also very ominous, like whining, like swirling moans and crying of just like it like goes from like very triumphant music to very ominous and off-putting sounds that happen. Very little dialogue. I mean, just from the opening, it's clear that Kubrick, very confident in the way he put the opening of this together. Also a great way illustrating existence before anything, kind of the Big Bang in some ways, being the sound, or pre-Big Bang, and then the planets and stars and the sun rising. Visually stunning, very epic. The score, is very stone cold classic score. The meat of the story, however, takes a long time to get to. Right? Then you have Earth, the sun rising, right? We get the Dawn of Man chapter card, and the movie drags, feels kind of pointless until we see the mission to Jupiter, in my opinion. So for almost an hour, it's just shots of, like, things happening. Like, very, like, pen floating in air and flight attendant grabbing it out of the air, and it's like clearly just showing off this effect. A lot of people seemingly walking, weightless, walking up walls and walking on ceilings, seeing how, all of the very minutia and logistics of, like, showing off this world. But once we get into the mission of Jupiter, then it's very interesting film, right? Very simple story, but very effective as well. And also, at the end, very psychedelic visuals, mind-bending concepts, as we've seen in other interstellar, many different episodes of Star Trek and movies of Star Trek, a lot of space travel movies that clearly have borrowed and taken from the ideas and the visuals of the end of this movie. So I do understand the impact of this film. I would have loved this movie at 90 minutes, as I've said. I feel like a lot of the shots early on are just Stanley Kubrick kind of showing off his abilities to make everything look like it's in space, to show the epic scale of the different ships and everything else, to show how every little thing in space works, how, like, the machines work, and just really trying to make you feel like you're there, but not really concerned at all about telling any kind of story in those moments. Which I'm sure at the time blew people's minds, right? Just to see those things, to see conceptually those things come to life on screen. But in today's spoiled minds, it's like, okay, let's get to it. All right. But I do want to talk kind of about specific scenes. I want to talk about the end. So for anybody that hasn't seen this movie, like I hadn't 2 weeks ago, I won't judge you for it. But if you're curious to watch and understand why this movie is a masterpiece, to understand why this movie is a piece of art, I would highly recommend checking it out. And understand, it's tough for about an hour. But then it's very interesting. And even that first hour, think of it as like an hour. It's kind of a meditation. It's tough to get through. The sounds can be off-putting. Could be confusing. Don't expect too much story. Just kind of let it wash over you and settle in. Maybe like do it with like a dinner, right? And then, kind of maybe put it on while you're preparing the meal or while you're eating and after you're done eating. I would say also this movie might be great for somebody who ingests or enjoys eating cannabis. If you like edibles on any level, if you were to take an edible at the beginning of this movie, in an hour when the movie actually starts to kick in, so would your edible, give or take, depending on your metabolism and the type of edible and how your body reacts to edibles, all those things. But usually takes, 30 to 60 minutes for an edible to kick in. And I think that would be, that'd be good, like right when the story's kicking in, to have the edible kick in and to feel that kind of stress, and also would help you justify any confusion you might have. I would say that would be a good pairing with this movie as well. But definitely enjoy the visuals and understand this was like the first time people were seeing anything like this. Some of my thoughts on the opening, my interpretations of the opening, when you have these apes living in harmony with each other at the very beginning, and then the monolith shows up. And I think, in my opinion, I haven't read any opinions. This is just kind of my interpretation as watching it. Kind of really my mind going crazy. There's a horror film I watched recently called Skinamarink, which is kind of insane that I'm bringing that up on this review. But it's very similar. The opening to this movie in many ways is very similar to Skinamarink, although Skinamarink has even less. Like, you are doing so much storytelling within your brain watching that horror film. And I'm doing the similar thing watching this, but given more to kind of come up with ideas and interpretations. So we have these apes seemingly living in harmony with everything, with nature. And then this monolith shows up, and it seems like that this monolith represents technology, potentially, or at least change on some level, right? Something new and novel gets introduced that's different than everything else and causes a change, which seems like that's when it leads to apes being more destructive, destroying things, killing things, right? And you have this kind of almost a montage of animals, these other animals that are there. I don't know if they're anteaters or what. I don't know what those animals are. But you see them like kind of falling down, seemingly representing these animals dying. And then you have like this ape destroying a skeleton with a bone. And like, it just seems like after the monolith, that is when things change, and greed and the worst parts of life kind of come through, where everything was harmonious prior to this monolith showing up. Maybe. Then we have this whole thing with the apes, and then it cuts all the way to the future, where there's like this commercial space travel. It takes its time showing how food is served in these like little boxes with straws. You know, this flight attendant walking on ceilings having these special booties on. The instructions for the anti-gravity toilet, by far the most ridiculous thing, right? Like, there's paragraphs that you have to read of instructions to use the toilet in these spacecrafts, which would never work in reality. If an idea can't be communicated with basic images, then people will never use it. People will never use it correctly. So these instructions for the toilet are ridiculous. Takes his time showing how everything works. Everything moves so slow. Like, we will watch somebody walk from one end of a room to the other end of the room slowly. We will watch somebody walk over to a machine and touch some buttons and just watch. Like we're watching animals in a zoo. Just like nothing's like exactly like when you go to a zoo and you just watch creatures in their habitat. That is what a lot of this movie is until the trip to, you're just watching animals in their enclosure doing stuff. But the scale is amazing. It's really cool to see, as this capsule is landing on the moon, this moon base. The capsule almost looks like a head. Like, windows look like eyes. There's a shadow that almost looks like a nose. Like, it's imagery is very interesting, and the scale to see all the little windows and the people as this thing's going and landing. That's really cool. There's a monolith that's uncovered on the moon, right? This where we hear the ominous score again. Very anxiety-inducing. These swarming moans that this score is producing, the score of this film. Then there's a high-pitched sound, right, as they go to take a picture in front of it. So very, like, off-putting, audibly, very off-putting, the moments of this movie. Right, this movie is, like, begging you not to watch it in so many ways. And then we have about an hour in. I still have no idea what this movie is about, aside from highlighting just the detailed look and feel of space travel. A lot of beautiful shots, guy jogging and shadow boxing. You have impressive camera work all over the place. It is cool when you see them watching these two space guys, as we're in the Jupiter mission now, watching these two space guys, watching the news on 9 by 16 aspect ratio screens, almost like tablets. Like how I film every episode of the Ray Taylor Show, I film in 9:16 aspect ratio. So it's cool to see that aspect in this movie as these two guys are watching the same broadcast, sitting next to each other, eating paste, this food that looks like paste. That was cool. You have Hal, the AI central computer, which just living and existing in pop culture, I understood the whole Hal computer thing. I kind of understood aspects of this story once we get to the story. And the scene where he gets in a pod to go replace a part that supposedly failed, right? All you hear is, like, there's a lot of audio of this movie that is very off-putting. All you hear in that moment is the guy breathing and what sounds like this gas or liquid rushing through pipes, like this hissing. Very nerve-wracking. Let's take a quick break from this episode because I want to promote. Are you looking for a way to take your love of The Ray Taylor Show to the next level? Look no further than Inspired Disorder Plus. As a member, you'll get access to a whole host of amazing perks, including the full week of shows, ad-free in both audio and video versions, a live painting archive, early access to the many faces, members-only discounts and deals, a podcast back catalog with over 600 episodes. But that's not all. As a member, you'll get access to my personal blog as well as my creative writing. You'll also get the chance to ask me anything you want. With all of these benefits and more, Inspired Disorder Plus is a must-have for any fan of The Ray Taylor Show. So don't wait. Go sign up now. Head on over to inspireddisorder.com/plus and start enjoying all of the amazing perks of the membership. And now, let's get back to the show. And there's this, like, they get the piece, they find out that it's actually not malfunctioning. So now it's like, okay, so is Hal wrong? Which Hal has never been wrong. There's never been proof of these systems ever having any kind of failure. Hal obviously blaming it on human failure, which is usually the most likely thing. But there's this possibility that Hal is malfunctioning. So the two guys go to get privacy so that Hal can't hear them. They go into one of the pods, kind of shut off comms, and test to make sure Hal isn't listening. But, of course, in that moment, so they can talk privately to see what they do if they suspect Hal is broken. And I was expecting Hal, like I assume, knowing kind of that Hal becomes kind of the antagonist of this movie. I assume that, like, Hal was actually listening, but knowing that they wanted privacy, not responding when they were testing to see if he was listening. But then you see from Hal's camera, because there's little cameras all over the place, that Hal represents Hal's eyes. It cuts to perspective of those cameras and seeing Hal reading their lips, which I thought was interesting, right? Could have easily been just like, oh, I was listening, but whatever. I think it's even more interesting that it was reading their lips, right? And then there's an intermission, which I was not expecting. Like, this movie should have been 90 minutes. There's no need for an intermission to be existing in this movie. And it's weird to see an intermission on a movie that's 2.5 hours long. But also, after having seen a bunch of movies from the 60s recently, when I ranked my top 5 movies that won Best Picture in the 60s, a lot of those movies, there was a lot of movies with intermission back then. So at the same time, I'm not that surprised that there's an intermission. Kind of surprised with the placement of the intermission. I would assume it would have taken place before the Jupiter mission. Like, you'd have them taking the picture in front of the monolith, crazy noise, cut to intermission, although most people would probably just leave at the moment. And then when you get back, oh, we're on the interesting part of the movie. And you could have just cut all that other stuff out. But anyways, it is interesting to see the scale of the main ship that they're on compared to the pod. Because you see the people in comparison to the pod when they get in them. And then when you see the pod come out, you realize how small this ship actually is. Where so many other things looked like this massive scale. These pods compared to the main ship, there is not that much space area living space on this. I mean, aside from the long hallway corridor that connects this ball part to this other part, I don't know. Interesting. It was just a lot smaller than I expected. Also, the reasoning why they get into the pods in general, like to go out and do the spacewalk thing to fix this thing, they get into a pod. The pod floats kind of away from the ship, and they get out of the pod, and they float back to the ship to then replace the piece, and then they float back to the pod and then come back to the ship. Like, aside from knowing what Hal uses the pod for, it's like doesn't make sense why they would even need the pod. Like, I would understand if they were in the pod and then they use the pod to do the repairs, but it's like they go out of their way, but obviously it leads to Hal kind of throwing the other astronaut into space when they go to replace the thing after he hears that they're going to shut Hal down if he's wrong. But whatever. Obviously, that's what it did. Also, the design of the space helmets from the top look like frog heads. And there's a lot of shots from the top of these astronauts in their space helmets. So the whole time I'm like, is this intentional to make them look like frogs for some reason? I don't know. But definitely noticed it. So you see him throw the astronaut away. Hal killing the people in cryo, right? Taking over this situation. Really saving himself, knowing that he's at risk. This artificial intelligence is at risk for being killed in many ways. And you see the camera angles change. You know, they're all... I mean, you have the one guy going in a different pod to go try and rescue the guy. And really cool scene where he has to, like, burst through into the airlock or whatever. That's great. And the camera, after he returns to the main ship, very chaotic, more handheld, very low perspective, very, you know, really matching the tension of the moment after he gets back on. And a cool scene when he goes to turn Hal off after realizing that Hal is trying to kill him in order to save itself. Hal trying to convince him not to turn him off and describing what death feels like to Hal was very, as his voice slows down, very interesting. And then we get the hissing with the breathing again. And then you get this video that's supposed to play when they reach Jupiter to the people, which is also interesting. That's like, we need you, we're telling you this now that you're there, because they had no idea what their mission was. And it was all to, like, just, you know, investigate this monolith that the monolith on the moon was pointing to. And then you have the kind of psychedelic when he, like, goes into the star portal. I don't even know what they consider it. Psychedelic colors, like, going by him. Very cool looking, which you see, like, every sci-fi thing has a version of this scene. And the ending of it, where he's, like, in the pod, is all of a sudden in this Victorian style bedroom where, like, the floor is lit up. Super cool. You see him, he sees himself as, like, an old man eating, and then even an older man laying in bed, staring at the monolith in front of him. Then you see him as a giant fetus in, like, inside the embryo, while still in bed, and next he's the fetus as the size of an earth, and the triumphant music. So, like, a great kind of mind-bending end to this whole thing. The kind of all is one, time is a flat circle, you know, outer space is no different than inner space. We're all that kind of ideas and things when it comes to space and the 60s and sci-fi and all of those things. I really did enjoy the end. I mean, this movie really gets good once we're on the mission, but it takes a while to get there. So definitely a mind-bending film in a time when film was starting to change, going from very normal musicals, typical stories, to being very experimental, trying new things. Obviously, the whole counterculture movement, the experimentation with drugs and psychedelics and all those things clearly inspired a lot of this stuff. But, you know, amazing that this was kind of that first really interesting take on space travel. Wasn't expecting the intermission. Movie could have been 90 minutes. It is a masterpiece in every way, except for like the pacing and lack of story in the beginning. Like, if there was a story, give me something. I mean, there's even a scene before we even get to the trip to Jupiter where it's like some kind of airport place. This guy on his way to the moon base, and he has like this meeting with like these three women and this other dude. Like, none of that stuff means anything. I don't think it means anything. You don't need to know it. I don't think it added anything to the end. Not that I paid enough. Like, I think after having nothing being said and all of a sudden there's some dialogue, I would have paid more attention. But it would have been nice if there was some kind of narrative going through. But I understand what this movie was trying to do. And I think is good. I'm glad I'm finally watched it. You know, inspired me to start preparing for a top 5 episode that I will do on Stanley Kubrick films, to rank my top 5 Stanley Kubrick films, to go back and rewatch many of his films that I've watched before. There's a few, like this movie, a few Stanley Kubrick films that I have not seen that I'm excited to finally see. I mean, he was making a lot of movies kind of. It seemed like he made a ton of movies, then there was kind of a change, and he started making kind of masterpieces. And I don't know. I'm excited to go back and dig through his filmography to do my top 5 films. We'll see if this makes the list. As I've gotten time away from watching this movie, I appreciate it more. And we'll see if I rewatch it before I do that top 5. But I am preparing for it, just to see how all of his movies stack up. Because, you know, this was... I do respect this movie for what it was. And I respect you, and thank you for watching this episode of The Ray Taylor Show. And I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on 2001, A Space Odyssey. Don't forget to tune in every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for more movie and TV show reviews. And join the conversation by leaving a comment or rating on your favorite podcast platform or over on youtube.com/Inspired Disorder. Until next time, enjoy the show. Subscribe to The Ray Taylor Show on YouTube and everywhere podcasts are found. Binge the full week ad-free over at InspiredDisorder.com/plus. Purchase Ray Taylor Show merch over at InspiredDisorder.com. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Peace out!
Today is the day where you wake up and you realize that everything that you've been dreaming about, everything that you've been wanting, every goal and wish and hope that you've ever had can become real. Dreams can come true. What you manifest in your mind, you can bring to reality.